going on here. There were some distilleries, but it wasn't having the impact across the country that Pendergast arrives in Kansas City and changes everything.
So Tom moves here in 1889 because Kansas City represented for the Pendergast opportunity.
Was Boss Tom a politician? Not really. Was he mayor? No, never mayor. Was he a gangster? No, he was never a gangster. He was something more powerful.
He realizes there's more power not being an elected official and controlling those elected officials.
He was able to deliver votes, and he did for election after election after election.
We're talking about a political machine that controls the financial, political, and to a great extent, the social life of the entire city.
Tom had such a grip on the city, they called Kansas City Tom's Town.
Tom had financial interests in some, maybe 24 above ground legal enterprises.
And he had at least 3 concrete companies. And when the city would have a contract up for, they needed a concrete manufacturer, they would ask Tom, and his 3 companies could give competing bids.
Small projects, large projects, all of that was going through to Pendergast.
And the concrete company made a lot of money out of the building that happened then.
You saw Municipal Auditorium, you saw the airport,
The music hall,
Power and Light, and the city hall.
county headquarters, and a lot of roads, too.
Kansas City in that era was divided into 2 gangs, the rabbits and the goats. My grandfather was a rabbit. Pendergast led the goats.
They provided a loose kind of welfare system, so he famously delivered turkeys at Christmas and Thanksgiving. He would find people jobs.
My wife's grandfather found himself out of a job and supporting his extended family. Went up the steps and said, "Look, I need a job." Pendergast asked him about his family, got a little bit of history, realized he was probably someone he could count on for a vote, so he wrote "Please oblige" on a piece of paper. He took it down there to the Ford plant, passed it through the gate, they opened it up and gave him a job.
If you could compare anybody in literature to Pendergast, it's obviously Jay Gatsby. Gatsby was a bootlegger, so was Pendergast. Pendergast did have rival bootleggers. Coincidentally, one of them happened to be my grandfather. Herman Epstein was a bootlegger. He had a product called Rickenbacker malt. That was a euphemism for malt whiskey. My grandfather was put out of business by Tom Pendergast. Prohibition didn't even exist in Kansas City. Not one alcohol-related conviction during all of Prohibition. It was an incredible time.
Where we have our distillery here, there were 200 speakeasies within a square mile around here, so it was a wild place.
Party.
In Prohibition, Kansas City didn't miss a drop.
You were living it up and partying it up in Kansas City. You were drinking some of the best spirits in the entire country. And that's because Pendergast didn't have to worry about the law.
It was a very creative town. We were known as the Paris of the Plains, in part because of fountains and boulevards, and also lots to drink and lots of fun at night.
We take these spaces where people drink, and before Prohibition, they're dark, dank, smelly places where vulgar men flee from their women in order to get drunk, and then when it becomes illegal to do it, it's like suddenly it's open to everybody.
We were one of the few places in the country, maybe in the world, that there were like all-night nightclubs, speakeasy, so to speak. That's what fostered the Kansas City sound, because you had musicians moving in from all over the country that were looking for work, and they could find it here.
Speakeasies are not dark and dank. They're beautiful, and they're well lit, and they're designed. The space needs to be filled with something beautiful and exciting and hot and sinful, and that's jazz.
If it was born in New Orleans, it grew up here in Kansas City, without a doubt.
I don't think jazz, swing jazz, or the kinds of jazz that we think about in the jazz age, ever would have happened if it had been legal to do so.
When Coleman Hawkins came in with Fletcher Henderson's band, we already had Lester Young here with Count Basie's band, and it was inevitable. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, this historic great jazz jam session happened here in Kansas City. It's impossible for things like that to happen without the influence of what Tom Pendergast did.
This did go from being kind of a backwater Midwestern town to being the place to see and be seen.
All the different ensembles playing riffs against each other, the walking bass, all of that. And to this day, that's the way we swing. Here in the new millennium, that started here in Kansas City. Yeah, baby.
So the fall of Pendergast basically begins with election violence.
Johnny Lazia, who was head of the mafia in Kansas City and a major national mafia figure and a pretty brutal guy. The Pendergast machine basically ends because Lazia went too far, killed people during election time.
FDR finally decides that he's had enough, and he appoints Morris Milligan, who happens to be my great uncle, to come in and clean up Kansas City. Well, that meant investigating Tom Pendergast, and what he found was that Pendergast was accepting a lot of bribes and not putting that on his taxes. I guess there's not really a line item for you to put bribes on your tax return, but because he discovered these bribes that he was accepting, he indicted him, put him in prison, and brought the entire Pendergast machine down.
Tom Pendergast goes to jail, right? Goes to Leavenworth, tax fraud.
I think what encapsulates the entire Pendergast story and the whole Tomstown story is that towards the end of his life, Pendergast is then put in prison. A Kansas City Star reporter goes and interviews him and says, "How did you do this? How did you create the Paris of the Plains, 250 speakeasies, the cradle of jazz?" And Pendergast says to him, "The people are thirsty." And that is so irreverent, so ballsy, and I think it basically tells the entire Tomstown story. The people are thirsty. Your uncle was one of the great party poopers of history.
You know, I don't think of him as a party pooper exactly.
Maybe you should.
But at least he was upholding the law instead of your grandfather, who was actually a bootlegger.
I take that as a compliment.
You shouldn't. Kansas City was called Tomstown, so we call our distillery Tomstown.
Is that why?
I think.
People ask us, are we distillers? Are we mixologists? We're really neither of those.
Yeah, we're heavy drinkers, as I like to call us. And in some respects, that whole thing was fueled by booze.
Yep. I know it is right now. I'm bombed.
But don't quote me on that, because I'm not sure it's true.
Theater major, theater major.
This is encapsulates?
This is my favorite story. He dies from a disease, which I don't know what it is.
You know, most people have forgotten about this, but there were two rival gangs in Kansas City, the Rabbits and the Goats. My grandpa was a rabbit, Mr. Pendergast was a goat.
Yeah, so you'll notice we have a lot of goats on our labels, and there's actually a goat taxidermy head in our tasting room. And a lot of people, they always think that we're Satan worshipers.
Right, and I'm not anymore.
Just a little.